the leading indicators, the things that cause learning to happen. A number of the points that Director Spence made in his remarks clearly are leading indicators. One that I want to reinforce, he talked about the power and influence of readiness, prerequisite knowledge. If you look at the students in your classrooms who are struggling, typically the kids who are struggling the most are the kids who have not mastered the prerequisites, are not ready for the new lesson. And the longer that goes on, the harder and harder it becomes for them to catch up. So that's what I mean by the distinction between leading indicators and trailing indicators. The following screen summarizes the 7 correlates of effective schools that we have found over and over again. These correlates of effective schools show up in elementary settings, show up in middle grade settings, show up in high schools, show up in the United States, show up in Canada, show up around the world. These are the defining attributes. It's around these 7 variables, 7 constructs that we want you to create the conversation for your own schools in terms of going forward. Let me go down through them and just give you a half a second on each one. But I want to remind you as we even begin to talk about them even briefly here this afternoon, that these correlates, there's a body of research around each one. You do not have to go out and invent answers to the question of what do we do? What do high expectations look like? There's a body of work that can be referenced and can inform the decisions and the discussions that you're having at your individual schools. Having said that, then let's just look at them. The first one is a climate of high expectations for success. If you don't have a belief system, and that's why I think it's so critical to say believe. If you don't have that belief system going in, that the kids can learn and will learn and should learn, then it's very hard to mobilize the energy. So what we want to do is talk about high expectations for success. The second variable we talk about and find over and over again is the issue of strong instructional leadership. Now, one of the things that has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years is we used to focus primarily on the principal as the instructional leader of the school. And as important as the principal he or she is, and there's no doubt about that, we now realize that leadership is a much more of a dispersed concept. We talk about teacher leaders, we talk about leadership teams, we talk about collaborative planning groups and so on and so forth, all playing a role in leadership in setting the course for the school. And the third variable is we talk about clear and focused mission. Clear and focused mission. One of the things you probably have heard maybe or read in some of your journals or magazines, they said that one of the toughest jobs of a leader is to keep the main thing the main thing. That's the main thing. Keep the main thing the main thing. We've got to keep a focus. There's too much that we could do in the name of good education, but if we just do it as if we're popping corn, it's not going to come together the way it needs to for the kids. So we talk about this issue of clear and focused mission. One of the school districts I work with out in the Southwest, they operationalize their mission of learning for all by making these 3 promises, for example, to the parents whose children attend that school system. They said, number 1, we promise you that when your children step into one of our schools, we promise you that they'll be safe. Second, we promise you that when they step into a classroom, they will be challenged. And third, we promise you that when they finish school with us, they will be ready to go on to college, ready to go on to the world of work. 3 promises, safe, challenged, and ready, captured what their sense of what their mission was in terms of the Learning for All mission. The fourth characteristic we talk about is opportunity to learn, student time on task. Opportunity to learn. If you were to disaggregate data, and we are required to do this in the United States between advantaged and disadvantaged kids, and that's the big gap in achievement is, as Director Spence said, it derives from or due to poverty. The poverty influence is tremendously important in schools. But when we look at the gaps that we have in the U.S. in terms of this, what we find is about 2/3 of the gap, 2/3 of the observed gap between advantaged and disadvantaged kids in the U.S. is first a gap in opportunity to learn. And it's not, you will never in Canada or the United States close the actual learning gaps until you first close the opportunity to learn gaps. And one of the opportunity to learn gaps has to do with this issue of readiness and prerequisite knowledge. and we have to be prepared to deal with that. So opportunity and time, huge variables, huge variables. The next characteristic, the fifth one, is the frequent monitoring of student progress. We say that in the effective schools, student progress is monitored frequently. And one of the questions that often gets asked is, how frequently should teachers monitor pupil progress? And the answer we give is always the same, and that is, how frequently are teachers prepared to adjust instruction? If a teacher can adjust instruction in his or her classroom every 10 minutes, monitor every 10 minutes. If a teacher can only adjust instruction once a week in that classroom, monitor once a week. But if that teacher don't ever intend to adjust what he or she is about to do based on what they're learning from the data, why bother monitoring at all? Why not just start in September and head for June and hope it all works out at the end of the year? Number 6, safe, orderly environment. In the effective schools, we find this orderly, purposeful, business-like atmosphere, which is on the one hand free from the threat of physical harm, but on the other hand is conducive to teaching and learning. Yeah, that's a tough balance to strike. You don't want rigid systems that lock down the freedom of children, and on the other hand, though, you have to have a certain measure of orderliness if this is all going to come together in the way that we want. And finally, the 7th correlate that we talk about is that there must be a positive homeschool relationship between the parents whose children go to school and the educators in the school. And this is easier said than done. The good news is that we now have a larger body of research about how to go about creating positive, forceful partnerships between home and school such that our kids will do better. What I'd like to kind of draw to a close here is this notion that up in 2003, a researcher in the U.S., Bob Marzano, many of you will recognize that name, Bob Marzano did a meta-analysis of the effective schools research over the previous 30 years. And by a meta-analysis, what that allowed him to do was he could look at which variables, which of those 7 correlates mattered the most. In other words, if you were to pull a string on 1 or 2, which ones would make the most difference in terms of student learning and student achievement? And what Bob Marzano found is that here was his list. And the difference in the, I'll walk down through it and comment on the list, but what Marzano found by looking at this meta-analysis is that these are rank ordered from the most important influences on student achievement to the lesser influences. And so he started off with opportunity to learn, time on task. We mentioned that one already. His 3rd variable in the listing was frequent monitoring. He talks about pressure to achieve. We call that high expectations for success. I'll leave it to you to judge the writings. They're pretty much saying the same thing. Talks about parent involvement, school climate, which is our safe, orderly environment, leadership, and then his 8th one that he adds to the list is cooperation, collegiality, working together, and so forth. What we talk about then is that if school improvement, from our point of view and from our experience in working with many, many schools all over the country, that school improvement requires working the levers that are associated with these correlates. And what we have to do is look at the research, look at the descriptions of best practices that are associated with these correlates, and use that at least to inform the planning processes that are going on in your individual schools. Each of these key variables can be thought of as a subsystem in the school, and like the subsystems in your car or in your body. The car is going to work best, the human body is going to work best when all the subsystems are working in harmony with each other, and that's what we talk about here. It all begins with men and women that constitute a school's learning community and their willingness to study, to understand, and to learn from each other. I would like to leave you with this challenge statement. My friend and deceased colleague Ron Edmonds said many years ago, he said, we have found that, he asks you this question, and the question is, how many schools do you have to see for yourself? How many schools would you have to see for yourself where all students, particularly students that are disadvantaged, minority students, how many schools would you have to see for yourself where all students are succeeding, are learning at a high level, they're demonstrating the proficiency? He went on to answer that rhetorical question by saying, if you need more than one, you have your reasons of your own for not wanting to believe that all kids can learn. I leave you with the challenge by saying there are hundreds of schools written about, described in research, in books, and best practices here and there. And I submit that work to you as at least a way to begin the conversation, to move beyond, to start with believe and move to achieve. I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk to all of you, and I want to thank you very much for the work that you do. I wish you the best. Have a great school year. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lezotte.